Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. What was it really like to be a soldier in the Civil War? Well, the way we know what it was like today is because a few soldiers who either kept a diary or sent a few letters have had that information preserved. Well, Andrew Upson wrote a lot of letters, sometimes 2 a day, and they have been preserved, and they've been read, and they've now been analyzed. Well, the person who did all the reading and the analysis and has now created a narrative in book form is Christina Volpe. Christina's the curator of the Barnes Museum and Homestead in Southington, Connecticut, and her book goes by the same name, the Barnes Museum and Homestead. Christina's going to be along in a moment to share the fascinating insights with us from Captain Andrew Upson about a major battle he was in, a prison he was in, and much more. This week's trivia question: who was Diamond Jim Fisk, and what was his very close relationship to gold? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. During the Civil War, you were either a copperhead or a wide awake. That is, you either believed the North had to wage war against the South to end slavery and maintain the Union. Those were the wide awakes. Now, on the other side were the copperheads, and many of them kept their sentiments to themselves, sneaking up on you politically and biting, just like a copperhead snake. Well, they believed that the North had no business fighting its fellow citizens in the South, regardless of the issue of slavery, and they wanted the Union maintained through negotiation, not war, even if those negotiations led to slavery continuing in the South. It was a brutal disagreement in the North, and it turned neighbor against neighbor all throughout the war. Well, one person who was very much in the wide-awake category was a man from Southington, Connecticut named Andrew Upson. Upson would be promoted to the rank of captain during the Civil War, making him one of the highest-ranking soldiers from this small, tight-knit Southington community. Upson believed in learning through travel and experience, too. He took a very long trip when he was in his early 20s up the Connecticut River from Connecticut into northern New England. And there he saw firsthand all the early mills and all the factories that were built as part of the Industrial Revolution. He came away with a newfound enthusiasm for what this young country might achieve. Upson came back, he got married, his wife Elizabeth and he had 4 children, and he even represented Southington in the Connecticut legislature. When the time came, he enlisted in the Union Army, intent on ending slavery, which he detested, and on keeping the nation together. Now, aside from his service, what really set Captain Andrew Upson apart was his letter writing. He was prolific. He wrote his wife and sons all the time, and sometimes twice a day. Well, thanks to those letters, we have an unusually comprehensive view of life as a Civil War soldier and officer. Well, also thanks to the curator of the Southington Museum where those letters are held, we know what's in those letters. Christina Volpe painstakingly read through all of the letters and then created a narrative of Andrew Upson's time in the war. It's a great read. Her book is called The Barnes Museum and Homestead, and it paints a vivid image of what the Civil War was like. So, Christina, I have been wanting to talk to you because I've heard all about these letters that are at this Barnes Museum, and you are the person who had to cull through those letters and turn them into the narrative that you've turned it into now in this book that you've published. And from what I understand, there are quite a few of these letters from Captain Upson about the Civil War. Tell us the story. How did you find these letters or come across these letters, and what did you have to do to get them into narrative form?
Thank you so much, Mike. The letters here at the Barnes Museum are incredible. There's over 200 of them. And how they came into the collection is really remarkable. The Barnes Museum has been here since 1836, and it's only ever been a house or a museum. And we are now celebrating our 50th anniversary as a museum. The letters came in here because Leila Upson, Captain Upson's granddaughter, inherited all of them and kept them here at the homestead as her only piece that she had from her grandfather. He did write home at least once a day, if not sometimes twice. And after his untimely death, everyone here in the Southington community really came together to mourn him. In fact, some people say that the soldiers' monument that's on the town green here in Southington is meant to be reminiscent of him. So everyone came together and got the letters that they had from Mr. Upson and gave them to his wife, Elizabeth Gridley Upson, so that they had something to remember him by. He was very well respected in the community and very eloquent in his writing. You really get to know who he is as a man, as a father, and as a soldier. He has plenty of opinions about the war.
One of the things I found remarkable, and I guess it makes sense, of course, when you think about it, he was very concerned about his wife Elizabeth and whether or not she was going to be able to maintain the farm because of all of the difficulties with the currency and inflation and everything else. So some of the letters were actually giving her tips on how to do that, weren't they?
Yes, he almost parents his children and, teaches his wife how to run the farm from afar, right? He encourages her with the changing seasons to sell what she needs to in order to make it through. He tells his boys to, listen to their mother, offers a lot of wisdom about gratitude, reminding his boys that what they experience here in Southington is so different than what he's seeing on the front lines, especially when he reports from the South. I mean, the 1860s are an unruly time, and to be alone as a woman maintaining the homestead was expected of Elizabeth. But it just goes to show the kind of marriage that they had, where even though he was so distant from them and that he felt so fervently about this cause, he still cared about making sure that she was taken care of here and that his children were taken care of. She was also taking care of his ailing father, who passed away while he was on his tour. And so, he had to almost kind of trust her enough to take these reins.
Now, when we think about war today and we think about the amount of money that, American taxpayers pay to keep up the Army and the kind of supplies they have, this was not the case for the Union Army in the 1860s as they're fighting the Civil War. There was a lot of scarcity. What were some of the things that he found that were particularly scarce?
Yeah, so you might have heard that term greenback before, right? Eventually, it's what we end up calling U.S. currency, right? The dollar bill is green today. But for a time, a greenback also meant a green stamp, because stamps for the longest time in this country, before a unified banking system, really were a form of currency. So you get these very anxious sort of notations in some of the letters from Captain Upson in which he, says to his wife, send stamps as soon as you can. If you can't send money, send stamps, because then he can barter to get some things. If you read about the Civil War, it's pretty general knowledge that especially 1862, 1863, the Union is really feeling the pressure financially supporting the soldiers, right? You got money if you enlisted, and then also ensuring that people were getting paid in a timely fashion. There really wasn't a strong mail system. There wasn't a way to really get people the things that they needed in timely fashions. So everything from money to your, the pension that you're supposed to be receiving, to clothing. He often writes about not having proper shoes or, a proper jacket, especially as things get a little hairier for him in 1863. So, yes, absolutely a tumultuous time for the Union, and it was difficult to really give the soldiers what they needed at certain points.
Of course, now he's getting ready to participate in what was one of the bloodier battles of the Civil War, the Battle of Chancellorsville. And this is, if you look at the statistics, 130,000 Union soldiers versus 60,000 Confederates. So you would say, wow, there's more than twice as many Union soldiers. They were supposed to encircle Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. And that didn't happen, and it turned into what was considered Lee's greatest victory. But, he's in this battle, and he gets into trouble early on when his group gets ambushed. Tell us what happens to him after the ambush and some of the stuff he had to go through.
Yeah, one of the bloodiest battles of the American Civil War. And again, it comes down to a communication error, which, is just unfortunately part of the time, not proper communication channels being carried out on the field. Now, for Captain Upson, what happened with him and how he describes it later on is bullets whizzing by his head, him having to play dead on the field, and soldiers eventually coming up to him and kind of kicking him, robbing him. He notes to his wife Elizabeth that one of them took her photo, but not to worry, he will get another one, and describes how he had to take someone else's boots and coat. After playing dead in the field, he is discovered to be alive and taken as a prisoner. And from there, he's marched to Libby Prison, which has been known historically to be one of the worst places for soldiers to be kept, one of the worst prisons. Now, for him, we talk about the sicknesses that we see. Two of the biggest causes for concern during this time were cholera and dysentery, and both of them could come from drinking bad water, which could have been anything from river water to a stream to sometimes even fresh springs that you'd think are okay, and then also just the conditions that they were being kept in. So he comments on that in his letters, seeing people around him die from these very difficult conditions and also being kept in the same room as people dying from these conditions. So commenting how he's scared he could get it, he could get dysentery or he could get cholera and pass away. Fortunately, he does not. He is let out on parole. There is what seems to be an exchange at that time, and he is released on a parole. And what happens to him is he's not allowed to go back to the field. He has to take a 2-week parole, like he's out of commission for 2 weeks. And his letters at that point kind of comment on that. I'm a soldier. I'm supposed to be on the field. I feel very weird not being on the field. And in fact, one of the most popular photos of Captain Upson that we have is him after getting out of Libby Prison, in which he comments that for nearly 2 weeks he ate nothing but scraps of bread, and that after getting out he was marched for over 20 miles. In this photograph, he looks completely drained. He's very hollow in the cheeks, and the photograph is taken not that long after his first photograph of him as a Lieutenant Upson leaving Southington. So we have these two images in the book that really juxtapose who he was when he left and who he became because of the war, which is pretty powerful, especially when you read it from his own hand.
One of the things in your book that was remarkable to read about was that the Union soldiers would write home and request their wives to come down for a visit in the Southern Territory, which, posed its own challenges, of course. But as you said earlier, this was a rough and tumble time, and for women to travel by themselves was also kind of a risk. But he nevertheless wrote Elizabeth and said, hey, basically, I got no money. I'm on furlough. Why don't you come and visit? Bring $50 with you. And she did that, didn't she?
She did. Yeah, I actually think it was a lot more commonplace than we think. We see it often in a lot of cultural adaptations like movies and shows of the Civil War of women who would do this, though still a questionable trip. They have this exchange in the letters back and forth a little bit before we actually can see that she came down. And a very prominent industrialist from Southington named William Clark, who owned Clark Brothers Bolt Manufacturing, was coming down that way. His brother was serving. She did make a portion of the trip with him and then did go on by herself. Based on what we can tell from the letters, she had enough money, like you said, to come down, to see him, to spend some time with them, and then they left. He also kind of convinces her to come down initially, too, where he says, this guy's got his wife and that guy's got his wife. Where's my pretty wife? When is she going to come and see me? And I think in the end, Elizabeth was probably so grateful for that because that would have been the last time that she saw her husband. I think an important thing to note here about the Civil War in general is that, especially here in the North, we did not think that the war would last that long. By the end of 1862, when the war is still kind of rolling on, there's a little bit of desperation up here because we're like, wait, we didn't think that this would last this long. And it's really taking a lot out of our community, a lot out of our spirit.
So from furlough, he spends a short bit of time at Camp Abercrombie, where he's in charge of 100 POWs who are waiting to go back to their units, and he's promoted to captain. And then he is sent to Fort Harker in Alabama, in a town called Stevenson, Alabama. And here in your book, I mean, again, this is great because it drives home the point of what the strategy was for the Union Army in the Civil War, which was control the railroads. That was the main form of transportation. And they were able to do that at Fort Harker. Tell us what was going on right around the turn of the year into 1864 that Captain Upson had to go and patrol, and what happened there?
Yeah, so he is watching the POWs. He has been promoted now to captain. Exactly as you said, they are tracking the rail lines. He's kind of being moved around a bit along those. So from Alabama, he later goes into Tracy City, Tennessee from there, and is taking these POWs along that rail line. Now, at this point in the war, there is a bit of desperation on the part of the South. The Confederacy has lost a bit of its organization. It's taken a couple of losses, right? Sherman's kind of march to the sea is that initial blow. But then we start to see more desperation out of Confederates in the sense that what happens to Captain Upson? So Captain Upson from Alabama is taking the POWs to Tracy City, Tennessee. He's at a rail depot that day. It's late December going into January of 1863, 1864. Seemingly out of the rolling hills before them, there is a group of, quote, Confederate guerrilla soldiers, right? These soldiers that don't necessarily have orders, but at this point have banded together to kind of take certain things upon themselves, right? So they come into the town and they end up ambushing the soldiers guarding the depot, thinking that they could potentially, regain this small depot for the Confederates. Unfortunately, while this is happening, Captain Upson is shot 4 times, and then he's taken prisoner for quite a few hours by this group of Confederates. Eventually, he's let go, and he's then taken to, a camp hospital, and he survives for 2 days his gunshot wounds. People in town are reporting that, he's looking better, he's going to do better, and then unfortunately, he passes away.
He was also passionate about ending slavery, and I'm just wondering how you felt when you realized that he died before he had a chance to see the war come to an end and slavery end.
I think he would have thought that none of it was in vain. I don't think he ever thought any of it was, right? I think he saw the bigger picture for our nation with his service, and I think he would have been delighted to hear, the Emancipation Proclamation. It's unfortunate that he didn't get that opportunity, but I think that the experiences that he gained, the people that he met, both white and free, formerly enslaved African Americans, that meant everything to him because he gained this experience that he tried to pass on to his children. And what better gift to give to our children, right, than perspective?
In November of 1863, just a month before he died, Captain Upson wrote a very special letter to his family because, you see, it was in October of that year that President Abraham Lincoln established the holiday of Thanksgiving. And so Upson wrote his wife and sons and reminded them to always be thankful for what they had, food, clothing, and shelter, a lot of which he was doing without in the Army. Well, his ancestors picked up his desire to keep the nation together, North and South. His granddaughter would end up marrying the grandson of a pro-Southerner Copperhead who had disagreed politically with Captain Upson when both had been alive. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path. In the Battle of Chancellorsville, that's the one where Captain Upson was ambushed and taken prisoner, 10,000 Northern and Southern soldiers died in just 1 week of fighting. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Christina Volpe, author of the book that bears the name of the museum where she is curator, the Barnes Museum and homestead. The answer to this week's trivia question, that question was, who was Diamond Jim Fisk, and what was his very close relationship to gold? Well, the answer is he was one of the most infamous so-called robber barons from the Gilded Age of the U.S. That's the period during the second half of the 1800s. His link to gold? Well, Fisk was behind the Black Friday gold market collapse that ruined thousands of people financially. Next week on Amazing Tales, we're going to take a look at this colorful character, including his theft of the Erie Railroad and his murder at a young age following a lover's triangle involving somebody other than his wife. Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.